There is a reason why people love Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films, or at least they are universally accepted as these groundbreaking films that took the Lord of the Rings from being just sort of like, for many people, another fantasy series and brought it into the mainstream media where these movies went on to win tons of Oscars and brought fantasy as a genre back into the forefront of Hollywood and allowed so many other fantasy franchises to move forward. I have no doubt that, as an example, Game of Thrones would have never been made as a television show had it not been for the success of the Lord of the Rings films from Peter Jackson. Not to mention, we wouldn't have Weta Workshop and Weta Digital doing all the amazing things that they did with the CGI on Gollum, which then in turn inspired films like Avatar and allowed motion capture to go into the next evolution. With, for example, all of the amazing Planet of the Apes films that have been done since then and beyond, with Andy Serkis sort of leading the charge in that motion capture arena. But what is it about the Peter Jackson films that make them so beloved in comparison to Rings of Power? Because at the end of the day, that's what Rings of Power really has here. Rings of Power has a Peter Jackson problem. Amazon has a Peter Jackson problem, meaning Amazon doesn't have Peter Jackson working for them. They could have had him working for them. There was an opportunity where Peter Jackson was offered the opportunity to look at the scripts, and then they backed out of it. And the excuse that they gave to the public was, well, for legal reasons, we can't have him reading things, blah 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 blah, NDAs, blah 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 blah. I'm Tim Anderson, aka Renfield, the bearded dwarven princess, and welcome back for another Rings of Power rant, everybody. Although today's rant is a little more specifically focused on Amazon, sort of, and how they failed to get a Peter Jackson level of intimacy into the Rings of Power show. Because at the end of the day, one of the things that Peter Jackson and Fran, and I always forget the name of the other scriptwriter, and that's on me for being a bad person for getting that. Philippa Boyens, I think. Um, those three people working on the scripts, and there is a place in this article which we're gonna go through. They talk about the hardest thing they had to do before anything else was getting the script right. How do you take the story of the Lord of the Rings and adapt that into a film or a series of films? Now, starting with the books, Peter Jackson knew that they had to do one thing, and that was adapt beloved source material and boil it down to the essence. Now, one of the reasons that, as an example, one of the reasons that Game of Thrones earliest seasons worked so well and allowed that show to become the phenomena that it was the fact that they were adapting existing books. They weren't inventing something new. One of the reasons that many people say the latter seasons of Game of Thrones failed so horribly is because they were working with material that they didn't actually have, and so they were making stuff up. And when they started to try to make stuff up, it didn't work anymore because they weren't following the source material that the fans knew and loved. So the core essence of what Peter Jackson did was follow the Lord of the Rings books and adapt that into the films that he made. He didn't try to write the novel that Tolkien had never wrote, as the showrunners for Rings of Power have tried to do. He took material that was already there, treated it with care, and adapted it into these three films. Now, they did create some stuff from scratch, and what's interesting is if you read through this article, which we're going to do here in a minute, there are some parts in here where some of it will sound a little hypocritical in the sense that we've criticized the Rings of Power showrunners for saying similar things. The difference between none of us trust the Rings of Power showrunners. I don't even know. I can't even remember their names. Payne and something else. As opposed to Peter Jackson, where there was a level of trust that was given him because he was doing it with such, a love and care for the original source material, and he wasn't having a big enough ego to say that, well, I'm just going to write the novel that Tolkien never wrote. So going through this article, this is an older piece from 2021, so it's a year and a half old at this point. It's over at thethings.com. It's a really good piece. I would urge you to read it at your leisure. I'm going to drop a link below. Um, The trouble, he says, with and he sat down with now disgraced Charlie Rose to discuss making the trilogy, and during that conversation, Peter had mentioned how impossible it was at one point in time to adapt Tolkien's works for a live action movie because the CGI hadn't gotten to the point where we could really tell that tale. There's even, if you go back and read through some of the radio dramas that had happened in the days when Tolkien was still alive, he struggled with trying to get some of the scenes from the books to even be put into a radio drama because they just didn't translate. They weren't able to convey what he wanted to convey even in an audio format. So imagine trying to do that in a visual format. So I get what these guys are talking about when they say that it just couldn't be done until CGI had gotten to the point where it could tell the story that needed to be told. Um, but he talks about here, he says, I think you have to be very careful that you don't make a disappointing film because so many people are passionate about the book. And if you're naming something Lord of the Rings, you have a responsibility to deliver something that's deserving of that title. And you couldn't do it before CGI had come along and gotten to where it was. Excuse me. He said the number one most important thing, and this is after he was asked, how do you take approaching liberties with the story? Such as the expansion of Liv Tyler's role as Arwen. And he said that the way we approached the screenwriting, because that was the real nightmare of this project, the script writing was the hardest thing we ever did. He, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens, yay, I remembered her name without being prompted. I'm so glad that I didn't botch that up. Um, we stripped it down to the bare minimum to find the spine of the story. We said, okay, this is about a little hobbit called Frodo Baggins who takes a ring, throws it in the volcano at the end. Everything that's not to do with Frodo taking the ring, we lose. Because Tolkien obviously went off on tangents in all directions, so that kind of got led of a rod of material that wasn't connected, and then we had to shape it into 3 movies, which was kind of hard. But this is really important. The tangents that he's speaking of, having as I'm going through the Mondays of Middle Earth show right now, P.S. This is the part of the video where I say if you haven't already watched that, make sure to go tune in every Monday at 11 a.m. Central because I do the read through. We're finishing up the Two Towers as of this recording, and we're about to get into the Return of the King. The tangents that he's speaking of are because Tolkien had created the Legendarium, this massive world that was, of course, later on explored through the Silmarillion and other books. And so there was a ton of this stuff that was just floating in his head that was like reference material. And so you'd be having a conversation, all of a sudden, here's this grand poem about Arendil, Aaron, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, that the Arendil, the father of Elrond, who took a Silmaril and put it on the bow of his ship and put up his ship and sailed it through this, got to Valinor and convinced them to do these things and then got put up in the sky and, you know, the North Star type thing. That's a tangent that doesn't have anything to do with the story of who is Frodo Baggins and getting that ring to Mordor. Is it an important element to the story? It is a world building component, but it is not a core aspect of telling the story of the hobbits on their journey to throw the ring into Mount Doom. And if you really get down into it, the granular components of it, this is where a lot of people who have had issues with Peter Jackson's films will say things like, it didn't include Tom Bombadil. I'll never watch it because it didn't include Tom Bombadil. And it just like, it wasn't true to the source material. Well, I would argue that in the scope of is Tom Bombadil important to the tale of the Frodo Baggins getting the ring to Mordor and throwing it in the volcano, it's not. Tom Bombadil has nothing to do with the story of the One Ring. He is a peripheral character that is there as sort of set dressing. And it's a fun little side adventure in the books, but it doesn't have anything to do with the core story. And if I were the writer adapting The Lord of the Rings, I would have thrown Tom Bombadil out as well. Just not something that I feels needs to be told. Um, Now, he went on to explain that he really wanted each of the 3 movies to have standalone stories. That's a smart move. But he also knew that all 3 of them had to exist in the public at once, and therefore the 3 movies would be considered 3 parts of one big story. Just he wanted to shape the arcs of the story individually with 3 movies, and then as a much greater 10 or 11-hour story. So really, they were doing what the Marvel films with the Avengers storyline tried to do with their like first and second blocks of films, which was tying all these individual storylines into this greater storyline within the Adventures, eventually getting to the end game 1 and 2. Um, it says here, because of this, moments had to be created for the movies that didn't exist in the book, such as the moment when Frodo tells Sam to leave in The Return of the King. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily true, that they have to make things up. Um, I will agree that there are areas where you might be able to take some creative liberties with things from the book. But I think the way they've written this, and this is where people are going to say yes, but if you agree with Peter Jackson inventing things for his films, why don't you agree with the showrunners for Rings of Power? And I would say that because everything that Peter Jackson was doing was to fulfill the narrative of Frodo Baggins getting the ring to Mount Doom, and everything Rings of Power is doing is to tell this convoluted story that has nothing to do with actual characters from the books, but instead is all about these invented characters like Halbrand and Nori and the Stranger and Bronwyn and Isildur's little sister who suddenly has a Palantir. And no, like that story, the novel that Tolkien never wrote, that doesn't need to be told. It's not worthy of Tolkien. It's not something that I care about as a fan. And this gets us to the next part of this because it says here, Peter Jackson says, we felt we were making the film for people who read the books 10 years ago, not 10 weeks ago, which momentarily confused Charlie Loss. He says, we must make sure that we have something that everyone remembers from the experience of reading the books. Essentially, what he was saying was people who read the books 10 years ago have less interest in the detail of each moment as opposed to what each moment represents or made them feel. So it doesn't matter if Aragorn was standing next to a luscious waterfall for a moment or precisely how he said what he said. What mattered was the meaning of what he said and where he said it. That's fair. That is a fair point to make. However, this is the area where creative liberties can go too far because if you read the most recent interview with the Hollywood Reporter that the showrunners for Rings of Power gave, they talk a lot about how, well, the essence of what Sauron was this, and this, and so we made the Halbrand character to represent this, and this. The difference here is that what Peter Jackson is talking about is, again, it doesn't matter if Aragorn was standing next to this waterfall for a moment or precisely how he said what he said, but what matters is the meaning of what he said and where he said it. But it still matters that Aragorn is the one taking that action, not an invented character that has nothing to do with the actual Lord of the Rings storyline. That's the distinction for me. The characters here are the secret ingredient. He says, we're making these films. What is it about the books that people have loved for 40 or 50 years? There's a secret to it. There's a key to it, and we wanted to know what that key was. And the one thing we realized is that even though Tolkien had the battles, the monsters, and all these fantastical elements, what people love about these books and what draws them back to read them over and over again are the characters. It's the hobbits. It's the courage. It's the bravery. It's the friendships, which gave Peter, Fran, and Philippa a real strong sense at the very beginning of writing these stories about what they should be focused on. At the end of the day, they always came back to the characters, and that's what made their movies so special. After all, it's precisely what made Tolkien's books so beloved. So, I would say that that's a fairly sincere take on things. And that's exactly what Amazon is lacking. Amazon doesn't have a Peter Jackson helming the Rings of Power who, a Peter Jackson who cares about the characters of the books and making sure that their stories are told in the way that they were told in the books. Instead, we have the arrogance of these showrunners who say, we're going to write the novel that Tolkien never wrote. We're going to pull what we interpret as the essence of the Second Age story from the appendices. We're going to create a slew of new characters that didn't exist in the books to represent those ideas that we've interpreted, and that's the story that we're going to tell. The problem is that it's not being marketed as a based on, it's being marketed as an adaptation of. And when you have all of these invented characters, it's not an adaptation of, it is a based on. And it's very offensive to me, as an example, that the book covers for the Lord of the Rings now have artwork from the Rings of Power. Like if you go to buy a new copy of the Lord of the Rings books, Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, Lord of the Ring, the Return of the King, it has artwork from the Rings of Power on it. It has artwork, literally, of the hands of characters that don't actually exist in the books. They have made up, invented characters from the Rings of Power on those book covers, which comes back to this is another video that I have coming out soon, which is the travesty of the Tolkien estate, because Simon Tolkien is it is what it is. But the Tolkien estate is ultimately to blame for what's going on with Rings of Power, not necessarily Amazon. But Amazon does play a role in this. At the end of the day, Amazon has this problem because they don't have someone at the helm of their show who actually cares about telling the story of the Lord of the Rings. They have their own agenda telling their own story. And they made it abundantly clear in the Hollywood Reporter piece that just came out, which is linked down below if you want to read that at your leisure. They made it abundantly clear that their whole obsession over the last 10 years was getting out of the scriptwriter's room and becoming showrunners. And so they were willing to do whatever it took to become showrunners of a show because they spent 10 years writing scripts that never made it to the television, and even though they were gainfully employed, that wasn't enough for them. They wanted to have a big break, and they saw Lord of the Rings as their big break. So these are two guys who are willing to do anything that it takes to get big. Peter Jackson was already an established filmmaker by the time he got to making the Lord of the Rings. He wasn't some nobody struggling in the dark to get things done and get his name out there. He had already made a name for himself, and so it's just a really different scenario here. Um, there's another article here too that talks about how over at denofgeek.com it talks about how faithful are Peter Jackson's movies to the Tolkien books. And there's some stuff in here that I think is important, like leaving out Tom Bombadil. I do wish they would have included the Scouring of the Shire. I think that was, in my opinion, I think that was one of the mistakes that Peter Jackson's films made, where it was killing Saruman, at Orthanc as opposed to, having him be killed. It was in my mind, is a much more impactful death when he dies at the end of the Return of the King and the Scouring of the Shire, because the way he dies, it shows how far he's fallen and how like this once great wizard has become this pitiful shell who's trying desperately to retain any little scrap of power he can, and at the same time trying to do it in such a way that he's getting revenge on those he sees as having slighted him, and then to see the little people come back and defeat him at the very end. um, it's very poignant, and that was something that they were missing from Peter Jackson's films. So even though I do love Peter Jackson's films, I also recognize that they weren't perfect. They had flaws, but those flaws were pale in comparison with the flaws of Rings of Power, which are like open wounds that are just right out there in the open, and it's hard to get past it when it's like right there on the face and it's seeping pus and ooze, and it's like, oh, what did you do? Um, I love the fact that, they focused more on Arwen's mortality, the temptation of Faramir, because even though it doesn't really happen the same way in the books, having just read The Two Towers, it was very interesting because I hadn't read the books since 2020 before the films came out. It was very interesting going back and seeing that Faramir was tempted on the page, and he admits that temptation to Frodo and Sam, and it makes them nervous. And he has this self-reflection of, if I were a lesser man, but thankfully I'm not. And Sam has that speech where he tells Faramir in the books, and they use this dialogue in the movies as well. He's like, "You have shown your true qualities, sir, and it is of the absolute top quality. You are a prestige, man, a credit to your bloodline." Um, yeah, so much stuff in here. I love John Howe and Alan Lee illustrating Middle Earth. Very, very cool. I think they did a great job of representing the spirit of the books with the artwork, and that was something that we've not seen from entirely. I mean, to some degree, The Rings of Power has had some very good artwork to it, but at the end of the day, it's more important that the storyline is followed, not that it just looks good. And that's the one thing why I can say that even though The Rings of Power looks good visually, it's lacking that storytelling that Peter Jackson had. And that's why at the end of the day, Amazon has a Peter Jackson problem. They don't have a Peter Jackson. They have these other guys who I can't ever remember their names because they're so uneventful and they've not done anything worthy of remembering yet. It's still The Rings of Power is a shit show. And so far, it hasn't been worthy enough of making their names recognizable by me and by most fans. So, I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them down in the comments below. If you got to the end, I hope that you're here to support the channel like these amazing people, because I get to do what I do because people like you who come in and watch these videos and like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, who join as members of the Adventurers Guild down there and support the channel financially. You can also do a super thanks as a one-off if you don't want to do a monthly subscription. You can also do on super chats and stickers on premieres like this or on live streams. It works the same way. So just go down in the chat box there and type an amount in, cup of coffee, or buy me $10 of a book, copy of a book or something. You can also go over to the Patreon page where my wife, my brother, and I have our own fantastical world. So Hopefully, we'll see you in all those places. And I'd love to have a greater conversation with you in the comments below, and we'll see everybody in the next episode. So stick around, stay tuned. Until then, happy reading, everybody.